Thank you very much for the nice introduction, for organizing this wonderful series. And I'm very happy to be here to give you a brief overview on our work, how this simple parameter of caring for the future can turn the tragedy of the commons into a comedy. And so this is embedded addressing the grand challenge of the 21st century for humanity, really, of staying below planetary boundaries, limiting the impact on the environment below an ecological ceiling. But on the other hand, of course, we don't want to have no impact on the environment because we want basic human needs fulfilled and achieve all the sustainable development goals. And we want to do that on a pathway safely away from dangerous, catastrophic tipping elements. So the crucial question here is, how can we enter such a safe and just space for humanity, how it is called? And despite the huge complexity of this challenge, what is clear is that we need collective action, rapid and large-scale collective action. So this is also what our work is trying to address, asking under what conditions do collectives act in their common interest. And so here we use a game theoretic approach. And just to recap, the most famous model, I would say, to capture this social dilemma aspect is a prisoner's dilemma, public goods type of game, here shown for two agents. Each agent can either cooperate or defect. And in this context, cooperation means limiting the impact on the earth, behaving sustainably, reducing emissions, and defection is more the business as usual strategy. So as I'm sure you're all aware, the mechanics of why we call this a social dilemma is as follows. If we assume we are agent 1 and agent 2 would cooperate, then we would be better off defecting because we are kind of greedy to exploit the others. But if on the other hand, agent 2 or the others would defect, then we would also be better off defecting because we kind of fear to be exploited by the others. And since the situation is identical for agent 2, we both would end up defecting. And now the dilemma is we could gain more reward if we're both cooperating. So this is known under the tragedy of the commons. And one insight that emerged from this realization is that we need outside authorities that regulate these situations. And then on the planetary scale, it would mean, okay, we need a world government. And since this is not very conceivable, then, okay, it means we are doomed. We have no choice. But we need to ask, is this really the game that we are playing? Because it does not capture catastrophic tipping elements. And so a common extension of this type of game was done or is done with so-called threshold public good games, where in this very simple version here, you can think of that a negative impact of collapse is added to the payoffs if not a certain fraction of individuals cooperate, in this case too. And you can already see that this negative impact of collapse does something to this greed incentive. And to summarize the kind of result that comes out of these type of studies is that this negative impact of collapse can turn the tragedy of the commons into a coordination regime, where both mutual cooperation and mutual defection are stable. And so here collective cooperation becomes a possibility. But in further and more detailed studies that look at the uncertainty around the threshold, where the threshold lies when this negative impact is induced, it is commonly known that here uncertainty hinders, again, cooperation. But I want to ask again, is this really the game that we are playing? It captures catastrophic tipping, but it might miss another crucial aspect. And to illustrate that crucial aspect, I want to emphasize that when it comes especially to the climate crisis, it's not only about the magnitude of change that we are inducing, but much also about the timescales and the rate of change that is induced. So here in this graph, you see the temperature anomaly of the last 22,000 years. And what you can basically see is that in only 50 years, we tipped from the 10,000 years of the stable Holocene period of the Earth, where all our cultural inventions took place, from the invention of agriculture to the steam engine to the computer, in what people call nowadays the Anthropocene, the age of humans. And now, exactly because of tipping elements, planetary thresholds in the environment, it is what we do the next 50 years will determine the next 10,000 years. But as we saw in current models of this type of collective action under catastrophic tipping, we saw that this time component or future component or even the environmental component was missing. And so this is the motivation why we set up kind of a revised model of the commons, where we embedded this classic social dilemma into a prosperous state of an environment. And now the logic is that defection is not only socially suboptimal, it also comes with a risk of collapsing the environment into a degraded state, where now the agents suffer from a negative impact of collapse and only eventually recover back into the prosperous state. And so by some mathematical analysis, we can look at the parameter space of this model here, spanned by the collapse impact n on the y-axis and the discount factor of the agents on the x-axis, which denotes how much they care for the future. And you can already see here we have three distinct regimes. So when the collapse impact is not too severe or the agents care not too much for the future, we are in the classical famous tragedy of the commons. And we also compared this by some multi-agent reinforcement learning dynamics, which is a similar logic as evolutionary game theory, but motivated and derived from individual learning processes. And here you also see that from all points in the policy, strategy, behavior space, the agents learn to defect. If we cross the blue-green line, either through increased severity of the collapse or more caring for the future, and agents are no longer greedy, then we are in the coordination regime, where it depends on what others are doing, whether we learn to defect or to cooperate. But in this model, we can also cross the fear critical curve, either through increased severity or more caring for the future. And if agents do no longer fear to be exploited, we enter what we call the comedy of the commons, where it is irrelevant of what others are doing. Everyone has an incentive to cooperate, and also the learners learn to cooperate. And by having kind of this two ways of analysis, we can quite robustly say that the simple parameter of caring for the future alone, without any form of social reciprocity. So we don't assume here that agents reacting to what other agents did, as it is commonly done. They are just very simple, very simple agents that reacting only onto the environment. And this already can turn the tragedy of the commons into a comedy in a dynamic environment, given that we have a sufficiently severe collapse impact. So what does this mean? It means, on the one hand, the scientific studies that assess the negative consequences from continued human emissions and human impact are absolutely necessary and crucial to do so. But they are not enough. We need another component. We need this caring for the future. And we saw a youth movement that put this caring for the future into the center of their message. And this also had a measurable impact on potential voters in Germany who consider the environment as an important problem. And it's to say that it's perfectly consistent with the economic rationale of the model that the younger you are, the more you should care for the future. But then, unfortunately, we saw how more short-term, immediate measures made the concern for the environment drop down below to a base level of 10 to 15%. So one conclusion that one could draw from all of this is that when it comes to voting, we should stop discriminating by age, and voting should become a birthright, just to put more weight on the future for collective decision-making. So in conclusion, in our study, we modeled collective action under catastrophic tipping with the formal framework of stochastic gains. That's how it's called. And by that, we introduced the components of time, caring for the future, and the changing environment in a consistent way to find that a simple parameter of caring for the future can turn the tragedy into a comedy without any form of social reciprocity. You can find all the details in this paper. And if you have further questions, please also reach out afterwards. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Wolf, for this great talk. And we do have time for maybe one quick question, if somebody has one for Wolf right now. Oh, yes.
Yeah, very interesting talk. To me, this is fascinating material. I have more comment than a question, I guess, but I would like to refer to a older paper in 1984 by Harold Kelly, and he talked about transition lists. And the interesting thing about transition lists is that one can move from one matrix to another matrix. And then sometimes that is very important from a time perspective. And that means actually that when people are making a choice, and I think this is also relevant to climate change and the issues that you describe, people are not only, their choices should not only be influenced by outcomes and how people transform outcomes or their social preferences, but also by what it means in terms of what is the next situation that we face. And actually, when you talk about negotiations, it's the same thing. Like, you often do not only make a choice for outcomes, but you basically are aware of what brings you to the next situation and what then is the impact of others on the problem, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this time element, this sequential element of decision making is very much embedded in your logic, I think. And so I think it's very nice and very realistic.
Thanks a lot. I'll look that up. And as you're right, the mathematics is exactly taking into account the next situation. Yeah. Absolutely.
I have a comprehension question. Did you model individuals as self-interested here, plus a discount rate for the future, basically?
Yeah, so they are completely self-interested, but have a discount rate for the future.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Wolf, again. And yeah, if there are further questions or comments, then please you can post those in the chat. And Wolf, you can also, I already see one comment there from Gianluca, so you can respond there. With this, I will now introduce our main speaker for today, who really does not need any introduction. Ernst Fehr has too many achievements and honors to list, really, including an honorary doctorate from the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, my alma mater. Yeah. His work has shaped the trajectory of cooperation research for more than 20 years now, and has, I think, guided many of the major questions that we study when we study cooperation, work on social preferences, on punishment, on social norms, and has really brought these concerns to the foreground as questions, while also providing theoretical accounts and empirical evidence to support these. And I think we all owe a great debt in our research to your work. So with that, please, we're very much looking forward to your talk. And before I forget it, if you have questions during the talk, you can just unmute yourself and interrupt for comprehension questions. And if it's anything more substantial, I think we can keep this to the end. With this, Ernst, please.
Okay, so thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to give a presentation today. So let me share my screen. And I hope you can see now all my slides. Can you see them? Yeah, great. So this is joint work with one of my previous doctoral students, Ivo Schurtenberger, who unfortunately went into private industry. And so we lost him for science, but I'm glad that I could cooperate with him on this project. Now, let me start by, so the title is The Dynamics of Norm Formation and Norm Decay. And let me motivate my presentation by pointing out something that I think most of us would agree, that social norms are really omnipresent and seems to permeate many domains of human social life. My view is also that the human species appears to be quite unique in the extent to which its social life is guided by normative prescriptions. Now, examples are the 10 Commandments, gender relationships. They are thoroughly permeated by social norms, dress codes, the honesty norm, the norm to keep your promises, the reciprocity norm, etc. And today, what I want to talk about is in particular collective action and cooperation norms. Now, let me give you a few examples from the human evolutionary history, basically. So the food sharing, for example, is very prevalent among hunter-gatherer societies. In particular, large game is shared quite a bit, and it serves an insurance purpose, of course, because large game comes in chunks and not infrequently. Then participation in warfare in hunter-gatherer societies is also an important issue. Here I just remind you of a very nice paper by Matthew and Boyd in PNAS, who wrote that deserters and cowards in raids against neighboring groups were chastised, tied to a tree and beaten by H-mates. So this is about enforcing social norms of participating in collective action. Then another example are the norms against strike breakers in industrial conflicts. Here I found a very nice quotation in an article by Francis, who wrote, "Those to isolate those who supported the scab union, cinemas and shops were boycotted. There were expulsions from football teams, bands and choirs, and scabs," this is the strikebreaker union, "were compelled to sing on their own in their chapel services. Scabs witnessed their own death in communities which no longer accepted them," which is a very striking example of enforcing collective action participation. The same holds for norms against raid pastors in peace raid system. And in my view, one of the really most remarkable examples of participation in collective action and steered by social norms is the voluntary participation in the British Army during World War I. You know, they didn't have a draft, so it was not obligatory to go to the army, but social pressure was just enormous, and the British Army was able to raise 2.5 million volunteers in just 14 months. And those who did not join, they faced the contempt of community members who attached big red patches to the free riders' front door at night so that everybody could see that the person living there was a dodger. Another nice paper here that is a job market paper by Anna Becker. I think I forgot at which British university is. She has a paper on the so-called white feather girls. And what this is the following phenomenon that girls, the women, they put a white feather on the clothes of men who wear civilian clothes and who were not wearing military clothes because they were apparently not participating in the army. And this was a sign of the contempt of the whole community vis-a-vis these non-participants in collective action. Now, these examples I like them a lot, but they just illustrate how important these collective action norms are. Now, let me tell you, I have no public working paper about this paper. It's a shame, although I have given this talk at least 5 or 6 times. But you may consult some kind of rudimentary components of what I'm going to tell you here, which is a little paper I wrote on behavioral foundations of corporate culture and a review article on the normative foundations of human cooperation in nature-human behavior. And you find components of what I say today in both of these papers. Now, let me come to my definition of a social norm. It's a very straightforward definition, and by a social norm, I mean that it is kind of defined as a commonly known standard of behavior that is based on a widely shared view how individual group members ought to behave in a given situation. And there are 3 crucial features in this definition. First, a social norm always applies to a particular group and to a particular situation. And it's not defined in terms of actual behavior, but in terms of normative behavioral standards. That means how group members ought to behave, not how they actually behave. It's the ought component that's important here. And third, the norm is widely shared. That means it's approved, and this is commonly known by the group members. So this is the definition I'm working with. And with that, let me raise many questions that I think, well, I find the topic of social norms still extremely exciting. I mean, I'm interested in this topic since I was a graduate student, and I think we made a huge progress over the last 3 decades, but there's still many open questions here. It's still a fascinating area of research. And here are a few questions and some of them, most of them I can address, not all of them. How and when do such normative standards of behavior emerge? How are they maintained and when do they decay? Does the existence of a normative standard have an independent causal effect on the type of behavior that is demanded by the norm? And if so, why does the social norm, exert a causal effect? Is it that the norm itself generates compliance motives? For example, when people seek others' approval, so approval incentives may become operative when a social norm exists. Or is the causal effect of the social norm simply based on conformity motives, so that people have some desire to conform per se, a view that's sometimes expressed in classic sociological work? Or is it because the standard, the standard of appropriate behavior acts as an equilibrium selection device? So is it that there are multiple equilibria and the norm coordinates the group or the society on a different equilibrium? These are still very important mechanistic questions, and there's a lot to do here with regard to making progress by doing innovative research. Then fifth, do norm violations undermine or change the normative standard and the extent to which it is widely shared? And sixth, does the standard also affect informal norm enforcement behaviors? So notice I have defined the norm not with regard to any actions related to enforcement of norm. So the enforcement is a separate issue, and norm is just defined as how you should behave and what the normative standard is. But the norm itself could also affect informal norm enforcement behaviors, and it could affect responses to norm enforcement behaviors. So these are all important questions that I think we have some answers to them, but we are far from understanding them very well. Now let me come to perhaps the main contribution of this paper. And the main contribution, or maybe one aspect of the contribution we make in this unwritten paper, is that we construct an empirical measure of the social norm, and I call this, you will see why later on, a high frequency measure. So we need a clean measure of the widely shared normative standard. And what we do in this paper is we develop an empirical measure of the level, the changes, and the degree of social agreement with a normative standard. Okay? And now, if you ask yourself, how should such a measure of the social norm look like? Well, before I go into that, let me say we construct such a measure, and you will see that we can say something on questions 2 to 7, but not on question 1. And we can, at the end of the talk, speculate. I have some ideas going back to work done by James Coleman about question 1, how and when do such normative standards of behavior emerge? But our paper gives these partial answers to questions 2 to 7. Okay, so now let's start with what we are doing after this introduction. By the way, if you have a question, just interrupt me and ask. So the workhorse with which I am operating is a repeated public goods game, because as I told you, we are talking about collective action norms here. And you will see we have various treatments, and in all the treatments, we have generic features of this public goods game. The generic feature is that there are always 4 group members, that 0 contribution maximizes an individual's payoff at the contribution stage of the game, regardless of others' contribution. So it's, if you just look at the contribution stage of the game has more than one stage, but if you just would take the contribution stage, you would say it's a dominant strategy to free ride. You can't say that because there are multiple other stages, so the game is embedded in a larger structure. But at the contribution stage, the dominant action is to free ride. You might express it like that. But the maximum contribution maximizes overall group payoff at that stage. And depending on the treatment, we have up to 4 stages per period. We have first, that always comes first, a norm formation stage. And I tell you in a minute what that is. We have second, a contribution to the public goods stage. We have third, a punishment stage, and fourth, a counter punishment stage. Now let me go into more detail into what the norm formation stage. I will tell you more about each of these stages in the slides that will come. But let's now focus on the norm formation stage, because that's the, if you like, the innovation here. And if we think what should be the requirements for a norm formation opportunity, we were thinking quite some time about this, and we came up, you will see in a minute, with a strikingly simple idea. But we envisaged several other ideas and talked about several other ideas. And the goal here is that the measure, we want a measure of a normative standard. And that normative standard should be related to cooperation levels. So that's a social norm with regard to cooperation levels, okay? And the measure should also tell us how widely the standard is shared, so how strong the agreement is on the standard. And one possibility to achieve that would be to have face-to-face communication. But we decided that this is not ideal because of many potential confounds. First of all, when you let people talk with each other in an uncontrolled way, you don't yield typically a clear, measurable normative standard. So people talk about all kinds of things, but it's very hard to extract a clearly measurable normative standards. Because people see each other, they might be exposed side payments. By lifting the personal identity, because people interact face-to-face, reputational issues might come up. Psychological issues like sympathy, antipathy might come up. So it's not optimal face-to-face communication. Another possibility would be anonymous or merely numerical communication, chatting via computer, on the computer. But this does also not provide a clear measure of what is normatively approved. And so we came up with our norm formation opportunity. And what we do here is the following. Each subject in the group of 4 answers the following question at the norm formation stage. In your opinion, how many tokens should each group member contribute to the project? Now note, by asking subjects about what everybody should contribute, they indicate their individual normative standard. So this is currently just an individual normative standard. However, what we then do is we just compute the average across all individuals, and we feed back this group average to the people in the group. So we tell them, and this is the sentence that we have that they see on the screen, according to the average opinion of your group, each group member should contribute the following number of tokens. Now, I believe that this enhances a shared understanding about appropriate actions, and it facilitates key aspects of a social norm. First, a normative standard and its shared understanding. Now, for what is coming from now on, I am interpreting the average individual standard as the social norm. We conducted an independent experiment in which we validated this assertion, if you like, this proposition. So you might have your doubts that this is the social norm, but for the time being, I treat this as the social norm. So I treat the average and the dispersion and the degree to which there is agreement on this average as the prevailing social norm. And if the social norm is, for example, weak, there might be strong disagreement about what's appropriate. If it's strong, there might be a lot of agreement. But I take the average as the level of what should be contributed to the public good here. Okay, now the nice thing is about this norm measure is I get a measure every period, because this takes place every period. So every period I have a measure of the social norm. And so I can observe how that measure of the social norm evolves over the periods. And so I have something empirically measurable. And that is the important thing here. I have that I don't talk about abstract things. I have something that is measurable here. Okay, now here is the overall experimental design. We had roughly 450 participants from the University of Zurich and Nottingham. And we have 4 treatments. We have a treatment, and they differ in the extent to which punishment and counter-punishment is present. These were stages 3 and 4 in the previous description of the overall game structure. And the degree to which the norm formation opportunity is present or absent. So when we have punishment present and norm formation present, we call this the norm formation treatment. And when norm formation is present, but punishment is absent, we just call it norm formation with no punishment. Or we call it, when punishment is present, but norm formation absent, we call it no norm formation. Okay, so that it becomes clear what I mean afterwards when I use these symbols, these acronyms. Okay, now, how does the full structure look like when we have all 4 stages? So the norm formation stage always comes first. And I told you how that is constructed. Sorry, I told you how that is constructed. Then there is, as usual in these public goods games, a simultaneous contribution stage. So each individual can contribute between 0 and 20 units to the public good. And if I contribute $1 to the public good, everybody in the group benefits by 40 cents, including myself, so I lose 60 cents. So this indicates that I have an incentive to free ride. But the punishment stage comes after the contribution stage, when people see everybody else's contribution in the public good in an anonymized way and can assign punishment points to the others in the group. And the punishment technology is 1, 2, 3. For every $1 I assign to punishing another group member, that group member loses $3, and I can assign up to $10 or invest up to $10 into punishment. and I'm giving an endowment of 10 tokens to punish, okay? There's also a counter punishment stage. And the punishment technology here is again 1 to 3. The decision space is I could counter punish from between 0 and 5 units. And here we implemented a situation where only group members can be punished who have punished me before that. Now, there's a reason why we did this, because one side purpose of this project was to study the power of social norms in an environment that is very hostile to norm formation. Because there is work by Nikiforakis and others, that's the famous title of his paper in Journal of Public Economics, Can We Govern Ourselves? And he introduces this counter punishment technology where I can punish my previous punisher. And you could argue with that because it creates kind of almost an experimental demand effect. If I can only punish my previous punish, if only those can counter punish who have been punished before. But we deliberately implemented that because it makes the environment very hard for cooperation to become a permanent feature, as a persistent feature in this environment. So we wanted to make it hard. We didn't need this counter punishment stage for our general purposes of norm formation, but we were interested in norm formation in an environment that is very hostile to collective action norms. Okay, so this is the setup, and now I have built into, I have here a slide, short break for questions, just because otherwise, so I invite you to ask questions at this point. Maybe not everybody understood what I said, or I glanced over it. So if you have now the opportunity to ask questions, if you like.
Great, thank you. We do have one question in the chat from Eugen Diemand, who is on a train and can't ask it himself, so I will do it for him.
Yeah.
He is wondering, how would you distinguish a true shared understanding of a normative standard from a self-serving signal of what you want others to do so that you can exploit them via free riding? Presumably, they knew that they will be playing the game when you asked the should question.
Yes, I mean, it is in principle possible that I say everybody should contribute, and then I don't. Actually, we don't see it, you know. So it's not, and when I later ask the validation question, is this really a social norm here? Do people really consider this as a social norm? It becomes clearer what the should component is. I think in principle, you might have people, he's perfectly correct, you might have people who strategically say everybody should and then they defect. But that's not what we, that's basically what we almost never observe. So there's a big, but we can study that. I don't have an answer. My vague recollection is that it's rarely the case that this happens. Yeah. Any other question? If not,
excuse me.
Yes, go on.
Hi. Yeah, so I just want to ask, maybe it's a bit further ahead. Your question asks specifically, how many tokens should each group member contribute to the project? How do you control the confidence of the agent when the question asks the subject about each group? There must be a confidence component of the belief of each group in a society. Do you control the confidence?
What we do is, you will see later on, we know of course the dispersion of the individual normative standards, but we don't ask the confidence, and I don't fully understand what you mean. I mean, this is a should question. This is not a question about whether what they actually do. So I tell you, you should contribute X, okay? And I have confidence that in my judgment, that this should be, so to speak, the normative standard against which everybody is is evaluated. Okay, I have full confidence in that normative standard. It's not a question about to what extent I believe that people live up to that normative standard. It's a question about what I think my normative standard is, and I have full confidence in my own normative standard, at least.
Yeah, so it's about the moral standard, but do you also consider the should question could also be about a reasoning, right? Rationally, how much should a person contribute? But it could also be.
Yes, that's perfectly correct. So the word should has ambiguous meanings here. And this is what we address with our norm validation exercise, because there we explicitly ask people for the what is the socially and morally appropriate behavior in this situation. So we will see that. So then where the should component is clearly more kind of tightly defined.
So you induce the agent to understand it's about the moral standard instead of.
I think the agents understand that this is about the moral standard. Yes.
Okay. Good. Thank
and
you.
that is also how third parties interpret it. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So let me then move on. So what are the conditions under which a stable and widely shared normative standard emerges? That was one of the questions we asked. And what we do is, as I told you already, we interpret the average normative request as the normative behavioral standard. It's clearly the best candidate for a normative standard in our setup. But we, as I told you also already, we provide an independent validation of this interpretation with additional experiments that directly elicit the normative appropriateness of different cooperation behaviors. And then we examine the movement of this normative standard over time, and we can examine the degree to which group members agree with or share the normative standard. So let me then come to the results. Does a shared agreement on a normative standard emerge over time? Well, what we do here is we look at the evolution of the coefficient of variation, which is standard deviation divided by the mean of the normative standard, in the no punishment treatments versus the punishment treatments. And what you see here is that in the punishment treatments, a strong social consensus emerging because the coefficient of variation declines over time quite a bit, so that there is a strong social consensus over time that emerges in the punishment treatments, whereas in the no punishment treatments, disagreement increases. Okay, this is a first finding we have. Increasing disagreement without punishment, increasing agreement on a normative standard with punishment. Now, how does the normative standard evolve over time? By that I mean the level of the normative standard. So what is the required cooperation, normatively required cooperation level? Again, with punishment, we have a pretty stable required level normative standard here, which is roughly 95%, close to full cooperation, whereas without punishment, there's a relatively lenient standard, at least over time. But what is interesting here is we always start very similarly, okay? We start very similarly, and then it diverges. So clearly the punishment opportunity has here a consensus generating impact, or the absence of a punishment opportunity has generates a lack of consensus. And similarly, the normative required level, the social norm at the beginning is very similar, but here it unravels, whereas here it stays constant with punishment. Now, the next question then is, do subjects obey the normative standard? And what we see is that we have strong obedience. So this is deviation, negative deviation from the norm. It's not the absolute cooperation level here. It's a negative deviation from the normative standard. And what you see here is a very stable, small deviation from the normative standard under a punishment opportunity and an increasing disobedience with the normative standard with a punishment opportunity. So the absence, the existence versus non-existence of a punishment opportunity has a very strong causal impact on the evolution of the social norm. Okay? And actually, this result has also led me to the conclusion that it's very hard, in my view, to conceive a persistent social norm without sanctions for getting punished when you violate it. So I think my belief currently is, if a social norm requires non-selfish behaviors, so that individuals, these are the interesting social norms, not the coordination norms where it's in everybody's interest to jump to another equilibrium. But if a social norm requires really non-selfish behaviors, such that everybody has some selfish incentive to deviate, you are unable to sustain that norm, in my view, unless you have some sort of punishment mechanism available. And I think this is what's supported by this evidence here. Okay, so then let me come to the dynamics of norm decay and norm maintenance. Now I have a whole series of econometric analysis with all kinds of regressions where we regress behavior and social norms on past behaviors and so on. But I just give you the upshot of this to shorten my presentation. So initially, there is a high normative standard with a fair amount of disagreement in both the punishment treatments and the no punishment treatments. This normative standard is immediately violated significantly without punishment opportunities. And this violation triggers further norm violations. It triggers a decline. The initial violation triggers a decline in the normative standard. And the initial violation triggers a disagreement about the normative standard. And each one of these three factors further feed into norm violations and further decrease contributions. Now you might then ask, what is the big difference between punishment and no punishment treatments? Well, the interesting finding is that with punishment opportunities, the forces described in 1 and 2 above, so this 1 and this 2, they're also operative. So if there are norm violations, they trigger further norm violations. We can see this. If there are norm violations, there is a further decline in the normative standard. These forces are also operative with a punishment opportunity, but they are counteracted by the punishment activities of group members and a strong agreement about the normative standard. So this is kind of, in a nutshell, what we find with regard to the dynamics of norm decay and norm maintenance. Okay, then after I have shown you this, let me come to the validation. So I have at least 10 times told you now that we validated our measure of a social norm. So let's show what we did here. We had additional experiments with what we call the Krupka-Weber method. So you will see in a minute what that is. In this task, subjects are asked to judge a given action as normatively appropriate or inappropriate. They have 5 categories possible for judging the action: as very socially and morally inappropriate, as socially and morally inappropriate, as neither appropriate or inappropriate, this is morally neutral. And so you get a 5-point scale, basically, from very socially appropriate to very socially and morally inappropriate, okay? And 0 is kind of the middle point. And now subjects are rewarded in this task if their answer about the appropriateness matches the most common answer. So there is a coordination incentive here. And the idea behind this measure is that if a widely shared normative standard exists, then subjects' judgments will be coordinated on the normative standard. So the idea here is, if there is a normative standard, then it acts as a coordination device for these moral judgments. And because you have a monetary incentive to basically give that judgment that is the modal judgment, they will hurt on the social norm, so to speak. That's the idea behind the Krupka-Weber method. And now we implemented this method in the following way. We recruited new subjects. We call them third parties. They read the experimental instructions of the original experiments. So they read the experimental instructions of a norm formation treatment with a punishment opportunity and of a norm formation treatment without the punishment opportunity. This was an across subjects design. So some subjects were only in this treatment. They read only this treatment instructions. Other subjects read only the other treatment instructions. And then they make judgments for period 1 and judgments for period 15. And in period 1, the third parties were informed about the actual normative standard of that period. So basically, the third parties were given the empirical information about what subjects did in the other experiment, okay? So in the other, I just told you what happened in the other experiment, in the kind of the baseline experiments. And now we recruit new third parties. They are informed about the actual average normative standard in period 1. And then they are asked to judge the normative appropriateness of low contributions, of medium contribution, which is 8 to 10 tokens to the public good, or high contributions, which is 18 to 20 tokens to the public good. We also elicited moral and social judgments for period 15. And here the third parties, they were informed about the whole temporal evolution of the average normative standard up to period 15 and the group's actual behavior up to period 14. So they were just as if they were in that period 15, but not having experienced that before, but just being told what happened in the previous periods, okay? And then they are asked again to judge the normative appropriateness of low, medium, and high contributions. Okay, this is our validation exercise, and now I show you the results. So what do we find here? Let me first look at the punishment treatments. Here you see the results for the punishment treatments. And now recall that in the punishment treatments, the average normative request rose from period 1 to period 20 from 18 to 20. So we had an increase in the average normative requests in the punishment treatments, okay? It's just to remind you of that. And what you see here is the red line tells you the normative appropriateness judgments in period 15, and the blue line tells you about the about the moral appropriateness judgments in period 1. And what you see here, sorry, I don't have a mouse here. I just have my this other instrument to move forward here. And what you see here is the following, sorry, that when you look at the moral judgments about high contributions, okay, they are judged as morally. I mean, I should tell you what the horizontal axis means. A 1 means very socially appropriate. A -1 means very socially inappropriate. A 0 means morally neutral, okay? So what you see here is that high cooperation levels are always judged as normatively very appropriate. Medium cooperation levels are judged as much more socially inappropriate in period 15 than in period 1 in the punishment treatments. This is the red line is below the blue line for medium cooperation levels. And for low cooperation levels, they are judged much more socially inappropriate, significantly more socially inappropriate in period 15 than in period 1. What that tells you is the social norm became stronger in the punishment treatments, because low and medium cooperation is judged as much more morally inappropriate, whereas high cooperation is judged as morally appropriate. Now let me go to the no punishment treatment. In the no punishment treatment, look first at the blue line and compare the blue line in the no punishment treatment with the blue line in the punishment treatment. And what you will see here is that they are very similar. So in period one, the blue line represents period one. The third party's moral judgments in period one are basically identical across punishment and no punishment treatment. But in period 15, the red line looks very different in the no punishment treatment. In particular, in the no punishment treatment, it's now the medium cooperation level that is the morally most appropriate action. Whereas the high cooperation level is now deemed significantly less socially appropriate compared to period one, which basically is an indication, and very low cooperation levels for the no punishment treatment. The red line in the no punishment treatment is above the blue line, which means that in period 15, low cooperation, it is much less negatively judged. It's much less judged as morally inappropriate, which basically lines up fully with the interpretation of the social norm we gave based on the average normative request. So what we take from this validation exercise is, yes, the average normative request really captures the essence of what a social norm is, and is a nice measure of social norms over time. Okay, now let me have again a short break for discussion if maybe somebody has a question. Otherwise, I move on.
Yeah, so we have one question from Roy Sultan in the chat. Roy, if you want to ask it yourself, an opportunity.
Yes, we could.
Good.
I think so. The two questions actually. One is that you talked about the causal link, right, from norms to behavior, and it seems from what you've shown us that the causal link from contribution to norms is sufficient to explain the results. So it seems there is something.
I will come to the causal impact of the norm now, because in order to study the causal impact of the norm, I have to exogenously vary the norm. And so far, I have only told you about the endogenous evolution of the norm over time. So currently, the results, I mean, when I run regressions about where I regress actual behavior on the social norm, what we find is, controlling for a host of variables, what we clearly find in these regressions is that higher social norms and more unanimously agreed upon social norms have a positive impact on contributions. But it's not possible to interpret this in a fully causal way, because behavior and norms, they are both endogenous in what we have shown, what I have shown you so far. So far, I have only compared punishment treatment with no punishment treatment, and have shown you how social norms respond to the existence of punishment versus non-punishment. And I have give you kind of a dynamic story how social norms and behaviors mutually reinforce each other. But this mutual reinforcement story that I told you, that cannot be given a fully causal interpretation so far, because a lot of this is endogenous. So what I need for causality is what comes now, an exogenous variation of the norm formation opportunity. Okay?
Yeah, that was my question. The second question is about the link from contribution to norms. Perhaps there is some, this goes back to the interpretation of the question. So maybe when you ask what people should do when without punishment, contribution goes down and they plan to contribute low, they still think that the norm should be high, but they feel hypocritical saying people should contribute much when they plan to contribute low. So that undermines the validity of the question and would also indirectly affect the focal point in the Krupka-Weber.
Well, that's actually not what we observe. So what I didn't have time to show you, because this is a very rich, meaty paper, is when I showed you the decline in the social norm without punishment, then I didn't tell you how this decline comes about. In fact, it comes about because there is a bimodal pattern. Some individuals in the no punishment treatment, they maintain a high normative standard. And other individuals, they basically give up on the normative standard. And it's not the case. I can also regress. Then that's what you do, by the way. I can regress my contribution, for example, on my own normative standard. Okay. And typically people contribute more when their own normative standard is higher. So they are not, the interesting thing is that people are on average not hypocritical. So they respond with contributions to their own normative standard. Okay. But what happens in the no punishment treatment, it's kind of as if some people say, oh, it doesn't make sense to maintain this high normative standard if nobody lives up to that, or many people don't live up to that normative standard. And so half of the people basically, I mean, these are groups of 4, 2 people basically on average, they go strongly down with their normative standard, and 2 people maintain it pretty relatively high. And this is why on average we see this decline. So it's kind of more dispersion than decline in a sense. You know, it's disagreement about what the norm should be. And actually we can regress also we can regress the actual contribution on the disagreement about the social norm. And there's also a clear coefficient here. The higher the disagreement, the lower are the lower is the contribution actually.
See, I think this is still consistent with the other explanation, but I understood.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I would have to, but I'm very grateful if you send me also an email about your interpretation. I mean, this is the disadvantage of Zoom. So I'm very grateful if you can communicate on this via email then later on, because there's still an opportunity to include these concerns into this not yet written paper. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
Okay.
So we have one question from Paul. Paul, can you keep it brief?
I'll keep it very brief. Yeah, I just wondered about how, if I know what people do, that information is so powerful for your judgments. And Cialdini talks about the descriptive norm in that sense.
Yeah.
Perhaps it would have been very nice, this is a question, if you had a condition in which people were not informed about what people do, but just about the conditions, that they fill in the blanks, kind of.
So you mean they are not informed about what people do in terms of cooperation?
Yes.
Okay. That makes it difficult for the punishment treatment, because then they are completely blind, so in the fog what they should punish then. But you will see, when I come now to the exogenous variation of the norm enforcement opportunity, and you will see perhaps some surprising results there that answer part of the question. So what the norm formation opportunity does? Because what we will see next is that the norm formation opportunity has basically zero impact on behavior when there is no punishment. That's quite interesting. And this surprised me. I was surprised by that, because I thought it has some impact, but it has zero. It's nothing is significant there. And so you really need the punishment to make the norm formation opportunity having bite, behavioral bite, which is, by the way, an important insight about when norms have an impact on behavior, you know. So let me come actually to that. So does the norm formation opportunity have a causal impact on behavior? Now, there are previous results that are consistent with the view that normative requests cause behavioral changes. In particular, Cialdini has also some nice experiments on this. But skeptics may not yet be convinced. And actually, the interesting thing is exogenous variation of norm formation opportunities is not something that has been frequently done, you know. That's not something that has been frequently done, and it's not so a simple thing to do. But here we have this easy method of taking away or making it available, this norm formation opportunity, and that's what we do. So we can now examine the causal impact of norm formation on contributions and on punishment of free riders and the effectiveness of the punishment of free riders. And let me look now on the impact of the norm formation opportunity on contributions. And what you see here is when we have norm formation opportunity, that's the blue line, contributions decline as usual, but without norm formation opportunity, they also decline. So there's basically no impact here. There's nothing significant here. So what that tells you is the norm itself doesn't help you to get at higher collective action levels. But when we do this in the punishment treatment, then we see a very stable impact from the very first period onwards. With norm formation, we have higher cooperation levels. Okay? And now the question arises, why is that the case? So is this the case because people have different preferences? Well, it's kind of tricky. If they had different preferences, then we should see it here too, shouldn't we? Is it the case because they move up to, I mean, what is known that with social preferences, we may have multiple equilibria when there is peer punishment possible. Okay? So that if you look, for example, in the Fehr-Schmidt paper from 1999, we show there is multiplicity of equilibria when there is a punishment opportunity and people have inequality averse preferences, but you could have also reciprocity preferences. You have multiple equilibria. So it could also be just that the norm formation opportunity moves up the whole group to a different equilibrium. And I come to that at the end. Now let me show you how the norm formation opportunity affects punishment behavior. And here we see something also really nice and surprising. So what you see here is the blue bars, they show the punishment behavior in the norm formation treatment. And the red bars, they show the punishment behavior in the treatment without norm formation. And what you see here on the horizontal axis is the deviation of the punished individual from the average contribution of the others in the group. So if I deviate negatively, that's what you see here. If I deviate negatively, I get more heavily punished by the others, okay? It's this rising punishment level here towards the left. And if I deviate positively, I talk about this in a minute. Now, what you see here in this left part of the figure is that the punishment of free riders in the norm formation treatment is smaller than the punishment of free riders when there is no norm formation. And that is quite interesting. Basically, with norm formation, I get higher cooperation levels, and I need to punish the free riders less in order to get to these high cooperation levels. So basically, punishment becomes more effective. A given amount of punishment of free riding generates a bigger impact. And that's maybe the reason why you see less punishment. You have a bigger effect on cooperation levels. Now, there is also something quite interesting on the right-hand side of the figure. And what you see here is that you see here this, for the red bars, you see here this increase in punishment for the people who deviate positively from others' contributions. And this is a well-known phenomenon. You might call it antisocial punishment. There's a residual antisocial punishment here, but it's smaller when there is norm formation. So the blue bars are below the red bars. So we have slightly fewer perverse punishment activities for those who contribute more to the group. And then we have a third phenomenon is that in the norm, this is what we have written down here is the higher the average contribution of the players who are not targeted for punishment, the more the target is punished. So let me explain this in more words. Let's say I want to punish Paul for a given deviation from the group average. Okay, let's say Paul deviates by 5 units from the group average. Now, the group punishes Paul much more for a given deviation of 5. The higher the absolute level of the others contribution level in the group, not including Paul, is. So the more cooperative the group is, the more it punishes a given deviation of Paul from that cooperation level. And that kind of tells you that this kind of ratchets up cooperation, because over time they might cooperate more, and the more cooperative the group as a whole is, the more it punishes a given amount of deviation. And this is kind of almost like a self-reinforcing upwards movement of cooperation levels. And this is much stronger when I have a norm formation opportunity. That is important here. And then, so peer punishment becomes much more effective and stronger for high average cooperation levels. And with that, I come to the mechanism that I talked about, that I alluded to before. What is the driving mechanism of this finding that norm formation has no impact when there's no punishment, but has a strong impact when there is a punishment opportunity? And we check this with an additional experiment. And some of you may know this paper that Urs Fischbacher, Simon Gechter, and I wrote on conditional cooperation in economic letters in 2001, where we basically measure individuals' cooperation level as a function of their beliefs about others' cooperation level. Okay? And when we do this, we find the following. So here you see others' cooperation, others' average contribution. Here you see my conditional contribution, my willingness to contribute as a function of others' average contribution. And what you see here is when there is a norm formation opportunity, then people are willing to contribute more for a given belief about others' contribution level. Okay? So basically, people do become more cooperative because of the norm formation opportunity. But this increase in cooperativeness does not suffice to generate a stable new equilibrium. Why? Because the red line and the blue line, they're persistently below the 45-degree line. If you look at 5-5 here, that would be here. If you look at 10-10 here, it would be here. So these lines are below the 45-degree line. That means in the absence of a punishment opportunity, cooperation is going to unravel for people who behave according to the red line and for people who behave according to the blue line. Okay, so basically we see an increase in cooperativeness that's triggered by the norm formation opportunity. And that is the mechanism that explains why under a punishment regime and norm formation, we have the two things that come together: higher level of voluntary cooperativeness and still a high level of enforcement of free riding, whereas compared to a no norm formation treatment. And with that, I finish, or I summarize what the driving mechanism is. The norm formation opportunity increases the willingness to cooperate conditional on others cooperating. Yet the pattern of conditional cooperation is such that in the absence of a punishment opportunity, cooperation necessarily unravels. If others do not cooperate, the norm formation opportunity is of little help. However, any mechanism, for example, peer punishment in our setup, that ensures that others cooperate, mobilizes the forces of conditional cooperation. And that explains why with less punishment, more cooperation can be achieved. And I've written down during the preparation of this presentation that I need to check something in addition, because I believe that the response to punishment is also stronger under norm formation. So people respond more vividly to when they get punished with higher cooperation levels. But that is, I need to check still. And with that, I summarize. First, we developed a simple method that provides a measure of social norms and how it changes across time and environmental conditions. This measure enables the study of the evolution of norms and their causal impact on cooperation, punishment, and norm obedience. Initially, a demanding normative standard emerges that is, however, subject to a fair amount of disagreement, both with and without punishment. But punishment opportunities give rise to a stable and demanding social norm that is largely obeyed. Disagreement quickly vanishes. Stable and demanding social norm emerges and is largely obeyed. And higher cooperation at lower punishment of free riders is obtained. Without the punishment opportunity, disagreement about the normative standard increases over time. There's a steady decline in the normative standard, an even bigger decline in the obedience to the normative standard, and the norm formation opportunity has no impact at all on actual cooperation levels. And with that, I thank you for your for listening to my talk and for your comments. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk and really sharing this really exciting research with us. We are already a bit over time, but I do see plenty of, I do see some questions. So maybe we can take 5 more minutes for questions, if that is okay.
Sorry for going over time.
Well, I think that was to everybody's pleasure. We haven't had many dropouts from the chat, so from the participants. I think I have Brian ask first, since you haven't had the opportunity yet. So Brian, please.
Okay. Kishu was actually before me,
but question already before, so I'll.
Okay. So I mean, lovely work, a nice way to explore norms. My question or more suggestion is whether you could learn some things by exploring other games that are not quite as complex. And this could link to the first talk of looking at coordination games or chicken type games, which is what was going on in the first talk. You're basically crossing a threshold to a different game situation. Or the related question, even if you're still playing a public goods game, you can vary the payoffs, the greed and fear, how much reward people get or how much punishment they get, would be a way of perhaps understanding more about what's going on. Thank you.
Yes, so I think the methodology with this norm formation stage can be applied to any game, of course. And that's something we want to do in the future. In particular, I want to study games. You know, public good games are basically games where you have an externality on others. And James Coleman hypothesized once in his Foundations of Social Theory that whenever people impose externalities on others, that the demand for a social norm arises. And this can be neatly studied in our framework. So we plan to set up another game without these externalities and then study whether there is a demand for social norms, whether there is something that really emerges here. And if Coleman is right, we should observe that no demand for a social norm arises. And so we can test that. But it can also be applied to other games, you know, coordination games. I completely agree.
Thank you.
So,
right, then, Kwaju?
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. I feel like I'm taking so much time. Just a very short question. Are subjects incentivized with a belief question?
no.
No. Yeah, because it's first order.
Yes. So they are in the validation exercise. They are incentivized. where when we apply the Krupka-Weber method, they have an incentive to coordinate on the most commonly expected answer. And that's the whole trick of the Krupka-Weber method, that people coordinate on on the salient thing, and the salient thing should be the morally most salient thing here. So there they are incentivized. But in the public goods game, it would have I am not a big fan of incentivizing in an already game that is already complicated enough, introducing another layer of complexity. I believe people have. It is in principle conceivable that people act strategically here and say, that's what Eugene Dimon mentioned initially, that I might hypocritically say everybody should contribute a lot, but then I myself don't do this. But that's not what we observe actually, you know. And so I'm not very too much concerned about this. Yeah.
Okay. And also you didn't, you said it's all about normative appropriateness. So you didn't ask about what they predict others will do. So it's nothing about the.
I mean, what we do is we use our social norms measure, of course, in a series of regressions as an explanatory variable and as an outcome variable, because we are interested in the dynamics. And what we do in the dynamic regressions is we regress outcomes. You know, the norm formation stage is typically within the same period it occurs first. So I can regress the contribution in the same period on the normative request in that period. And I can regress it on my own normative request, and I can regress it on the normative request of the group, the average, or of the other three. And here I can basically see to what extent I see this hypocritical, for example, behavior. I mean, and what we see is that the higher, I mean, this is almost, it has a very high, there's an extremely high correlation between an increase in the normative request by 1 unit increases contributions by almost 1 unit, almost, yeah, okay. So this seems to be tightly correlated. But of course, we can't give that a causal interpretation, as I said, because it's not an exogenous variation in the normative request, but it's still informative. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks.
All right. So we have 4 more questions, and I really would.
We can collect them, and I answer them all at once.
Let's do that. Okay. So, Letita.
Yes, thank you for a very interesting talk. I was wondering about your last explanation of why these punishment systems only worked better when only in a norm formation condition, or norm formation only worked better when there was a punishment system, right? And I think your explanation is really clever and really appealing. But I was also wondering, what do you think about the symbolic function of sanctions? So the fact that there is a punishment system present already kind of communicates that there are people disapproving of behavior, which would be in line with my own work, but also with Yuval Feldman's work, because also in your paradigm, if people punish defectors, they actually also are signaling that they disapprove of. So they're kind of signaling a social norm in itself, really. So maybe the punishment can also function as a social norm.
Yeah, thank you. I've written it down so that I don't forget it. Interesting question. Yeah.
And Gianluca.
Yes. So I'm picking up on something that has been mentioned already in the chat. So I think, if you look at the pioneering works on social norms like David Lewis, a convention study, and also the work by Bob Sagden and Cristina Bicchieri. So there is always the idea that the social norms are both about normativity, but also about behavior, about expectations of behavior. So I mean, I'm not sure. Of course, we can discuss about labels, what is really a social norm, and I'm absolutely fine with having a neat piece of work with a slightly different definition on social norm than what others does. But still, I think this would be valuable to keep in mind that. Quite a lot of theoretical work argues that the empirical aspect also matters. And this is actually what you also find, because you find an evolution of the normativity of the action within the game that is completely different in the punishment vis-a-vis the non-punishment treatment. So it means that the people took into account how others behaved and reframed the normativity, what they meant by what others should behave during the game. So this leads me that I'm still not sure that what you are clearly identifying a social norm as such. So maybe, you've already done a lot of experiments, but maybe you could consider to ask not only about normativity, but also expectations about real behavior and qualifying something as a social norm when the two somehow converge.
Okay, thank you very much. I have also written down what you said. Is there somebody in addition who has a question?
Yeah, so Anna and then Rati, and please do keep it short.
Yes. First, thank you for your presentation. I'm like, it's more of a thought that builds up a bit on the previous comments. I was wondering, because some definitions of norms, if I recall correctly, Bicchieri's especially emphasizes the need of expectation of punishment for something to be a social norm versus something that is a moral norm that is held regardless of the punishment. So I was wondering also if maybe your results, which are very reasonable to me, also link maybe towards this duality between moral norms that persist. You said two people in a group always persist with a high expectations and some drop, versus the social norm that kind of is built up in this norm formation stage when there is punishment. So that's just my general line of thought. So I just wanted to ask about your thoughts. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks. And finally, Rati.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation. My question is about what you think about cultural differences and a different type of punishment mechanism. For example, exogenous centralized punishment, and how we can expect the differences in this question.
Yeah, thank you very much. So let me shortly answer all questions. I find the idea of a symbolic nature of punishment and of a signal of what's normatively correct to do very interesting. And it's just not kind of possible to study that right now. We need another treatment variation. One treatment variation we could use is just a very weak punishment opportunity. So basically, by spending $1, I can only take away 1 unit from you. Or, currently I have this 1 to 3 punishment technology. And if you weaken the punishment technology, what's left is only the symbolic nature of it. Or you could basically take away, I could assign disapproval points to you. You could call it disapproval points. Instead of making it monetary, call it disapproval points. You might even call it in the instructions disapproval points, and then you might see what happened. So this is a treatment variation you could play out. So I'm to study this question. Then with regard to the empirical aspects, well, I think empirical versus normative aspects, I think one advantage of the design we have chosen is that we can exactly neatly study the interplay between the normativity and the actual. Because we see how actual behavior evolves and we see how normative judgments evolve, basically, the normative standard. And this makes it explicit. I think this is the advantage here, that we have this, it's explicit. And so I fully subscribe to the view that there is this idea that there are descriptive norms and there are kind of non-descriptive norms. Basically in the final experiment, when you look at the people's willingness to cooperate, conditional on others' cooperation, you might interpret that as a descriptive norm. I mean, I like to interpret this as social preference, but you might also interpret this as a descriptive social norm. The more others cooperate, the more I'm willing to cooperate, this upward sloping line. I think, and if you like, the descriptive norm changes in a sense, but I think that doesn't tell you what is the underlying mechanism behind the descriptive norm, and I think it's social preferences that underlies the descriptive norm. So I fully agree that this is in the interplay between the actual behavior and at the actual cooperation behavior, the actual punishment behavior, the actual counter-punishment behavior, and the normative standard. That's what's kind of really interesting. That's what we wanted to study here. And finally, Anna's comment. So I deliberately deviate from Christina Bicchieri's definition of a social norm because I want to keep it to its bare bones. And I treat it as a normative standard that tells you how you should behave, and it is not kind of intermingled with expectations about punishment and so on. The normative standard is a normative standard. And I did have 15 years ago a different definition of a social norm, but at some point I decided it's better to define it to really kind of take the bare bones of what a norm is. It's a normative standard. How you should behave. It's in a morally, in a normative sense. And I think that has distinct advantages. Then finally, cultural differences and centralized punishment. I have another paper that's even on the internet, and it's called The Culture of Cooperation. I think it's called like that. Is together with Tony Williams. And in that paper, we give people the opportunity to vote with their feet into institutions. So basically, you can choose to vote for going into a centralized punishment institution. You can, at the beginning of every period, you can go into a peer punishment institution or in a no punishment institution. And the interesting thing is that people basically, after a few periods, always go into punishment institution, half of them into peer punishment, the other half in centralized punishment. But the centralized punishment is exerted by a democratically voted judge, democratically selected judge. So that generates legitimacy. So it's not an all-powerful Leviathan here. It's a democratically elected judge. And we have very nice results in that design. And I think I could easily imagine that there are cultural differences here according to whether people prefer peer punishment versus centralized punishment. Well, thanks a lot for all these questions. They are very interesting. I think you recorded, Simon, you recorded the whole thing. So if you could send me the link that I could look at the questions again, so that I can benefit from the questions again when I try to write this up. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for the talk. Thanks everybody in the audience also for the great questions, for the great discussion. And I hope you will join us again in 2 weeks when we have the last cooperation colloquium for this semester with Nicola Raihani.